I am now being joined by Joy John. She is a global affairs analyst at Bellcrest Institute, Washington, D.C. We will be talking to her about the resumption of aid in Gaza and the UN agency's disapproval of airdrops due to the hunger and starvation. Good to have you join me this weekend. This crisis in Gaza has become even, more concerning. Now, let me take you back to Iraqi Kurdistan after the 1991 Gulf War. The US, the UK, and others dropped aid from the C-130 transport aircraft. But the issue was that some aid landed on minefields and some died as a result of, that. Now, the world has been condemning what Israel is suggesting, which is to allow aid into Gaza by air. However, via airdrops, and while that's, allowing aid, there are concerns being raised. Now, what's your assessment of that situation?
Thanks for having me. So, airdrops by design are last resort methods because they are really efficient. What we're witnessing right now in Gaza is a scramble to work around a humanitarian crisis that should never have been allowed to reach this point. What the international community is demanding right now is scattered air deliveries, is not demanding, I'm sorry, is not scattered air deliveries, but through land, consistent, organized aid through the land routes that we have with proper oversight, just to ensure that it reaches the people who need it most. So we're saying no to airdrops because just like you said in the intro, it could hit on anything, and that's not what we want. But through land, they're going to be able to coordinate delivery and make sure that it reaches the communities and people that it intends to get to.
Well, now, the United Nations chief, as you know, Anne Bowen, has condemned the aid drops with suggestions as to how it should be done, which is via entrance on land at specific points or routes. But do you see Israel budging to the call so far? And can Trump influence, that decision?
At this point, it depends on one, how the world sees Trump and the level of influence he still has. But that aside, let's unpack that. The UN chief is right to express concerns. It's justified because the UN has decades of experience in delivering aid in conflict zones. We're looking at Darfur and Sudan to Syria to Afghanistan. So their call for humanitarian, structured humanitarian corridors of delivery is justified here. But again, it has to be with full cooperation of parties, reflecting the best practice that, we're used to. Aid should not be a headline stunt. What leaders should tap into for what they say in the streets clout. It shouldn't be about the headline stunt. It should be the outcome of agreed frameworks vetted by neutral parties and neutral actors that are grounded in international humanitarian law. Because anything short of this concept will or may end up politicizing the whole situation. And we have civilians in need. And those are the ones who are going to be affected by the decisions we make, decisions the leaders make. So back to Trump, it depends on the level of influence he still yields, considering the events that has happened in the last few months.
Now, speaking of which, what's also your assessment of the, abandonment of the so-called ceasefire talks in Qatar? We hear that Netanyahu and, his team had to leave Qatar because they're uncomfortable, so to speak, with the terms being put out there by Hamas.
Well, a ceasefire is still possible, but in reality, it's getting extremely difficult to do so. What we are seeing is a collapse of trust. Not just between parties on the ground, but among the regional and global actors trying to mediate. That's why I went back to the US president and the level of influence he may still yield, or the impact of his influence today, considering what has happened in the last few months. The abandonment of that negotiation talk in Qatar is a serious setback. There's no way to downplay it, but it's not the end of diplomacy. Historically, when breakthroughs like this come, they come when there's pressure and from unlikely quarters, and that could be even Egypt or back channels through Europe. But both sides, I think, need to shift from the rigid responses that they have today and move towards face-saving compromises. Otherwise, we'll continue watching possible PAL up while people are suffering. So it's not in the interest of the people really for this to drag or for the fallouts to happen. So we just need to, get back to the drawing board on one page.
Absolutely. But how's Trump's presidency influenced this war? I mean, his campaign promises, some say a direct opposite of what is happening, even though he is at the center of these negotiations. See, during the, MAGA campaign, he was, talking about sponsoring war being stupid, referring to the Biden administration. And now, a lot of people have a different perspective as to what he says versus what we're seeing now.
Yes, and again, I take you back to my earlier comment on the trust issues that we have and where people see his influence. But it will be unfair to criticize the office of the U.S. president, one. But it all depends on how they take him and how they hold his word. So he needs to back up his words with action, and his actions need to be seen as fair. It also needs not in terms of his influence. It all depends on how the administration drives it through. Let's not go back to Biden. Let's not go back to Obama. This is Trump 2.0. And this is what we see, that whatever he tells us and what he does is what he will be assessed with. So I would not want to disparage the office of the U.S. president, but I think that it's important that he walks his talk and he begins to earn the trust of people around the world.
I'll take you to, just the news before we jumped into this conversation about, France having to recognize a Palestinian state of, Palestine in September. I wonder what your take is on that.
Say that again, please.
Talking about, France, Emmanuel Macron recognizing Palestine as a state of its own, as opposed to what Trump and Netanyahu had plans for. What is your take on the recognition of Palestine as a state?
Well, if the facts on ground justify that Palestine can become a state, then I think that it should be allowed to follow through due course. It's been a long, drawn battle. It's something that has to be approached with a lot of diplomacy. So I think that if it is justified and if the international bodies ascertain that it is due for Palestine to have that ownership of a state, then let's go for it. But this long war is people are dying. And the impact of this war is severe. It's beyond what's on paper. And don't forget that just as we have information here, the information on ground is just as worse. So it's important that, one, we take everything with a pinch of salt and assess it as they come. Trump has a stance towards Israel. He's leaning towards Israel, having very clear. But then let it go through diplomatic sources, let it go through the diplomatic channels, and let's see where they put Palestine.
Now, I'll take you on the United Nations, role in all of this. Besides the fact that we talk about aid when it comes to the United Nations, some people wonder what else are they there for, and how impactful are the ICC's sanctions on, countries that begin wars like this?
So the role of the United Nations is multi-layered, and I say that because yes, it facilitates aid, but most importantly, it is the only global platform where conflicting parties, even those not speaking to each other directly, remain part of a common diplomatic structure. So the resolutions it comes up with may not always be enforced swiftly, but they set the precedent for international accountability. Now, as for the International Crime Court, its actions may not show immediate impact as well, especially in the short term. But over time, they build a legal and moral case against impunity. Even the threat of an indictment can affect how leaders act, how they travel and engage globally, because that tag is there. So these institutions may not be perfect, but they are still central to the global efforts to demand accountability from those in power.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joy, for joining us on the show today. She's a global political analyst, Bellcrest Institute from Washington, D.C.